Hey everybody, good morning. We're taking a look today at Job 29, and he continues, as yesterday he had his discourse on wisdom, and, today we see that he's sort of reminiscing of how things used to be. He goes through, how life used to be before this sickness and all of this evil fell upon him. So taking it up, you look here, he says, in verse 2, he says, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through the darkness. When the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me. And he's remembering, the days of when God was with him. You see, God is still with him. He just doesn't see it, doesn't feel it. He just knows that the evil is upon him as well, that evil is causing all of these things to happen. And let's take a look at when when he goes into the city, starting down in verse 7 and so on. Verse 8 says, then young men saw me and hid. He says, then the aged arose and stood. The princes refrained from talking. The voice of nobles was hushed. You see, Job's talking about when, this is when he would go into the city, that he was a big deal, that people really respected him. People really looked up to him. I mean, even the kings and princes, they looked up to him. It says here, the princes refrained from talking, so they looked up to him. There was that day, and as we get into tomorrow, when we get into chapter 30, we're going to see that it isn't so much like that anymore, that stuff is gone. But for today, we see Job, the man, this is the first time we get to really see from his point of view the man he used to be, the man that God had ordained him to be, the man that God was shaping him. And I like verse 14. It says, I put on righteousness and it clothed me. That reminded me of something that's available to us today. We also can wear righteousness. And the Apostle Paul, when he wrote to the church in Ephesus, and he was in chains, held by a Roman guard, and he looks up at that Roman guard and begins to see the armor that the Roman guard has on, and he begins to use that as a way to teach us of the armor that God has put over us. And when he speaks of righteousness, he calls it a breastplate of righteousness. And why? And I look at it and I say, why is it a breastplate of righteousness? Why isn't a helmet of righteousness? Or why isn't shoes of righteousness or something like that? It's because righteousness is something that should be over your heart and should protect your heart. And we see that Job, the man that he was, righteousness covered and protected his heart. That's just who he was. He did these things because, you go to verse 16, says, I was a father to the poor. Verse 15 says, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. See, that's just the man he was. He walked in that righteousness, and he allowed it to cover his heart. And it just came out of him. And that's a good little story for us. Good little story for us, that we see how God was blessing him and he was operating in righteousness. He didn't keep it for himself. The gifts that God give us are not for ourselves. He gives us these gifts so that we can share them with everybody else. I like to say that the word love should always be in a capital letter. Why? Because it starts up top, comes down, and through us, it makes a big L. It makes a big L. And we see that's how Job operated. That's how he lived his life. Are we? So, guys, I love you all. Have a super, super day.